We're going to be in our Bible in John chapter 21 and verse 19. Turning there, I have a slight lengthy introduction, so I'll talk while you guys turn. So when Pastor asked me to preach this about 2 Sunday nights ago, and he asked me what Sunday night I wanted to do, I instantly thought, oh boy, I have no idea what I'm going to preach on. So obviously I started praying and asking the Lord what he would want me to preach on, and about a week passed by and I didn't really have a knowledge of what I was going to preach on exactly. So when I came to church to work on Tuesday, I thought I probably should read a couple chapters throughout the day and maybe listen to a couple messages, try to get something from the Lord to see what he wants me to speak on. And I did one of those really desperate prayers where you just pray, Lord, please, just let me flip to this chapter that you're going to have me preach on. That's literally what I did. I flipped to a random chapter in the New Testament, and I flipped to John chapter 21. And I instantly just had a feeling that I was going to preach out of that chapter. And I'll give you a brief overview of the chapter. In this chapter is the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was crucified. And this was the third time, and he was on the shore. The disciples didn't know it was Jesus on the shore. The disciples were out fishing. Peter and a couple of the other disciples were. And they're out fishing on the boat, and then Jesus tells them to go cast their net on the other side, and they cast their net on the other side and catch some fish, and then they realize, oh, it's Jesus. So Peter, being the very what's the word I'm thinking of? Very spontaneous person he is. He jumps out of the boat and swims to Jesus, and all the other disciples come in the boat. And Jesus has food for them there, and he feeds some of them. Right after that, they have the where Jesus asked Peter, you probably all know it, where Jesus asked Peter to feed his sheep. He says, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. He asked him that 3 times. And then right after that is where we're going to start off, is in chapter 19. This is right after he asked Peter to feed his sheep. And I'll start off reading in verse 19. It's a little high. Sorry, not 19, verse 20. Verse 20, then Peter, turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following. And the disciple whom Jesus loved, if you don't know, is John, which also leaned on his breast at supper, and said, Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee? And then the next verse, it says, Peter seeing him, and that him there is talking about John. Peter seeing John saith to Jesus, Lord, and what shall this man do? And he was talking about John. What shall John do? And Jesus said unto him, if I will that he tarry till I come, and that he there would be talking about John, if I will that John tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. And then one more verse down, in verse 23, it says, then went the saying abroad among the brethren that this disciple should not die. And then basically right after that, it says that that's not what was going to happen. Yet Jesus said not unto him, he shall not die, but, meaning what he did say, but if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? So tonight I'm going to be talking about following on God. That's a passage where I've read it before multiple times, and then I read it this time, and I thought that was really interesting. So tonight, that's what I'm preaching on. I'm preaching about following God, but we'll start off with a word of prayer as we get into it. Dear Jesus, Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for everything that you've given to me, Lord. I pray that you please fill me with your Holy Spirit as I preach your message, Lord, and I just pray that you please help it to be a help to the people here, Lord, and please get us all back safely tonight as we leave, and help us just to keep it in mind on following you, Lord. Pray this all in your name. Amen. So the first point is follow God in the task that he gave you. Don't focus on or worry about what God asked someone else to do. And we saw right here in the passage that Jesus basically told Peter Peter, what does it matter what John does? It doesn't matter what John does. What is that to thee? Follow thou me. Jesus told Peter just to follow him. And Peter didn't need to get jealous about what God asked John to do. He just needed to focus on what Jesus asked him to do. And that's really the beauty of the Christian life. If the Lord asks you to be the pastor of a church, you need to be the pastor of the church. You need to be the best minister, the best witness to the people around you. And if the Lord asks you to be in full-time Christian service, then go into full-time Christian service and be a minister and witness to people there. If the Lord asks you to be a layman, work a 40-hour week at a job, and you're going to come into contact with people that probably the full-time Christian servant or the pastor are never going to come into contact with. And you need to be a witness to them, and also maybe you can run a Sunday school class or clean or do something at the church, or how to get the women in there if the Lord asks you to be a full-time mother. It's a big job, and the Lord asks you to train up the next generation. It's a big task, and that's what you should do. Even though you might be limited, you might not be able to witness to as many people, you might not be able to do as much. But if your child goes to win 100 people for the Lord, that's on you. And if you weren't to train them, you wouldn't have that happen. But the Lord asks everyone to be a witness, though. The Lord asks us all to be a witness to the people around us. And like I said before, don't focus on or worry about or be jealous of what the Lord asks someone else to do. Just focus on what the Lord asks you to do. So my first point was follow God in the task He gave you. Don't focus on or be jealous of what God asks someone else to do. Second point is be obedient to follow God in the task that He gave you. So often the Lord asks us to give a tract to someone, maybe to witness to someone, maybe just to simply talk to someone. Or you can give even bigger from there. Maybe the Lord asks us to move to a different state, move to a different city, move to a different church. Maybe the Lord asks us to quit our job and to go into full-time Christian service. You never know what the Lord will ask you to do, but we just need to be obedient to Him. So often we'll get nervous, we'll get scared, we'll get maybe even a little lazy, be too much work to do this or that. And we don't follow through on what the Lord asks us to do. And all we're really doing is we're just hurting ourselves. We're basically just putting our finger in between two bowling balls and slamming them together. Just flat out hurting yourself, and that hurts if you've never done it before. But I promise you that following the Lord will be the most fulfilling and joy-filled life that you'll ever have. It might not be the easiest. It probably will be pretty difficult. You'll have ups and downs, but it'll definitely be the most fulfilled and the most joy-filled life you'll ever have. Joy doesn't come from doing what you want to do. Oftentimes when you do what you want to do, you find out that you aren't too happy a couple years down the road. But doing what the Lord wants you to do always will bring you joy. And also, you'll be thankful when you get to heaven. When you get to heaven, stand before God, you'll be very happy that you decided to do what God asked you to do and not doing what you wanted to do. Living your life for yourself. And that was the second point. Be obedient to what the Lord asked you to do. The first point was follow God in the task He gave you. Second point was be obedient to follow God in the task He gave you. And the third point is follow God in spite of the task He gave you. Even if you don't understand the reason for the task God gave, even if you don't understand the task that God gave you, just do it anyways. The Bible is filled with examples after examples after examples. You're to read the whole entire Bible, you'll find tons of them. I think of Abraham, traveled around and lived in the tent basically his whole entire life, because that's what the Lord asked him to do. And then you think of Abraham, who went up to go sacrifice Isaac, and he had no idea why he was supposed to go sacrifice Isaac. He didn't know that when he got up to the mountain that the Lord was going to provide him with a ram while he was up there. He just knew that he was supposed to go sacrifice Isaac because that's what the Lord asked him to do. So Abraham did it, And when he was going to go up, the Lord cried out, Abraham, Abraham, and gave him a ram to sacrifice instead. And you think to yourself, man, I don't know if I could do that. But the Lord asked him to do it, and Abraham did it. You think of Jesus when he turned the water into wine. Mary came to Jesus with a problem and said, Jesus, there's no wine. So what does Jesus do? He has the servants go get some water and some pots, and servants had no idea why they're getting water in pots, but they just did it anyways, and then the Lord turned it into wine. You think of the feeding of the 5,000. The Lord asked the disciples to sit down all the people in groups. So they sit down all the people in groups, and they had no idea why they were doing that because there was no food. And the Lord provided the food. You think of Elisha. This one's kind of crazy. You think of Elijah right after he got the mantle from Elijah. He was supposed to sit down and be fed by ravens and sit by a brook and drink from the brook until the brook dried up. So obviously you think of a brook's at least a little big. So he was definitely there for at least a week, probably maybe a couple. And that's what the Lord asked him to do for however long he was there. The Bible doesn't say how long he was sitting there. It could have been a couple years, it could have been a couple days, it could have been a couple weeks, you don't know. But you might think in our lives, if the Lord asks us to do something like that, you may think, well, I'm not being a witness to anyone. I'm not even in contact with anybody. Why in the world am I sitting here doing that? And the reason being is because if you're doing what the Lord asks you to do, he can do more in 1 year than you would be able to do in 10 years doing what you think is important. And in our life, there is going to be plenty of times when the Lord asks us to do things that make absolutely no sense, or we just look at it and think, Lord, why are you asking me to do that? That doesn't make any sense to me, but the Lord didn't ask us to understand, he just asked us to obey. And I really think of a recent example, personal example. I think of Brother Rogers, a.k.a. our old pastor, who just retired. And I think of him, how he retired at a pretty young age. It wasn't expected. No one expected him to retire. But the Lord asked him to retire, and he thought it was the Lord's will for him to retire from the church and go do something else. And I'm sure he had no idea what was exactly going to happen with the church. He had no idea in his own life what he was going to do. Probably didn't know exactly, but now we can look back from it about a year later, and you can see that everything worked out pretty well for the church, and we got a good old pastor, Pastor Drew. And we also got, pastor had a very successful, Brother Rogers, not pastor. Brother Rogers had also everything worked out pretty good for him as well. And when the Lord asks you to do something, just go ahead and do it. You may not understand. And on the flip side, if something happens to you, sometimes things will happen to us and we'll get scared of following the Lord. Just don't worry about it. The Lord has it under control. The Lord knows the reason. And maybe one day we might never know the reason. But we just need to continue to follow the Lord and do what the Lord asks us to do, no matter what happens to us. And that was the third point, was follow God in spite of the tasks he gave us. And lastly, as kind of a side note, this is kind of, doesn't go along with my grand old follow the Lord and the tasks, but as kind of a side note, don't be so quick to judge people for the things that they do. So often we're so quick to judge as Christians, so quick. Person in the church gets into a tough spot and we instantly think, or maybe gets in a tough spot, gets into a couple car accidents, maybe just things are going his way, instantly think, oh man, he must not have been doing what the Lord asked him to do. Maybe he's not tithing, or he's not being honoring the Lord in his finances. Or think of the example like Pastor Rogers. He's retiring as a pastor, retiring at, how old is your dad? I have no idea. 50, 60. He's retiring at age 60. How in the Lord could that be what the Lord asked him to do? How could he retire at 60? That's not what the Lord asked him to do. And then we'll think less of that person, or we'll judge that person and try to understand what the Lord asked him to do. And in 1 Samuel 16:7 it says, "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him." And this was talking about when he anointed King David. "For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for the man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh upon the heart." And also in James 4:12 it says, "There's one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another?" And honestly, who are we to judge? Who are we to judge what someone's motives are? Who are we to judge why something bad may happen to somebody? The answer is we have no idea why it might happen to someone. We have no idea why they might have did something. You think me and Megan are reading through the book of Job together, and just reading through the book of Job, you look at his life, and his life was flipped to the mountaintop, to the absolute lowest value you could ever get to. And Job was flipped to that, not because of any specific sin he did. It was just to bring God the glory in the end. And all of his friends, all of Job's friends came, and basically all the book of Job is his friends talking and Job answering his friends. And all of his gems basically come up to Job and say, "Job, only things like this happen to wicked people or people who have sinned. Come on, Job, you can tell us what you did." And that's basically all they did. They just accused Job. And we can't be too hard on Job's friend, because probably if something like that happened to someone in our church, we would probably condemn that person too and think the exact same thing. And I know I would have most likely condemned them too, sorry. Or we think of John chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. We see Jesus and his disciples, they're passing by a blind man who is blind from birth. And his disciples look at Jesus and they say, "Who did sin, this man or his parents?" And Jesus told them, "Neither hath sinned, but that the works of God should be manifest in him." And I'm going to read for you again, James chapter 4, verse 12. It says, "There's one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another?" Instead of judging people, instead of being a judge of somebody, instead just try to help the person, to lift the person up. You have no idea why they did something or why something happened to them. We just need to focus on helping them or trying to get them to where they should be. So as a review, first of all, we're supposed to follow God in the tasks he gave you. Don't focus on or be jealous of what God asked someone else to do. Instead, just focus on what God asked you to do and do it. Secondly, you're supposed to be obedient, to follow God in the tasks he gave you. The Lord asks us to obey, not to understand. Thirdly, follow God in spite of the task he gave you, even if you don't understand. The Lord can do more in 1 year using you than you could do in 10 years doing what you think is best. Even if you don't think what you're doing matters that much, doing what the Lord asks you to do will always end up for the better, and you'll be doing the Lord's work and not your work. Lastly, let God be the judge. James 4:12, "There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another?"